Hello everyone, we are in the radio studio of the university, and this segment of the MOOC is going to be a conversation with a young stellar colleague who I'm going to introduce in a second, and we'll be talking about European identities and European values, especially as those things are seen from outside of Europe by a European person. So the young man sitting next to me is Dr. Kuhn Florian. He's a full-time professor at this university, Budapest Metropolitan University, and he received his PhD at the University of Singapore in communication and new media. Parallel to his studies and before these years, he also studied and has degrees in Arab studies and international relations. And he spent time doing research and guest teaching in various countries all around the world, including Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, the UK, and many other places. He has lived in Southeast Asia for a couple of years. He will talk about these experiences, but let me mention now that among those countries you find Malaysia and Singapore, and as we speak, I can tell you that next week he is once again leaving for, I think, Thailand. So he's an expert on the region and has done a lot of comparative work concerning European identities, values, compared to Asian values and identities. So my first question to you would be to try to explain to us, not only the audience, but myself, because it's a really interesting question. You have lived and traveled and studied in Southeast Asia for many, many years. Has it changed, or has it had any effect on your view concerning your own European identity? So have you become a different man after spending a couple of years in a really far away region of the world? Or has it stayed stable? So how do you see those changes, if there are changes at all?
Yes, so hi everyone. Actually, I lived 8 years in Asia, 5 years in Singapore, 2 in Malaysia, and another year in Cambodia. And as you are saying, travel itself is a very transformative experience, so it changes you. But I can also say that my identity has changed. I usually say that I learned as much about Asia as much about Europe and being a European in the same time. So how my ideas of Europe changed when I was in Asia for such an extended period. When we are here in Europe, we like to think about Europe as a very diverse place. Actually, there are more than 40 countries in Europe. I just checked, there are more than 200 languages spoken in Europe. There are
I didn't know that.
A variety of religions, political system, political ideologies represented all over Europe. And we like to think about it as a very diverse place, and we think that the world sees Europe in the very same way. And when I traveled outside of Europe, I realized that Europe, from Asia, for example, is a much more homogeneous place. It seems to be a much simpler place in many ways, and actually it coincides to the historical experience of Europe, how historically European identity has formed and got established, because there was always an interaction between Europe and between the rest of the world. And how Europe started to think about himself or itself as Europe, as a single entity, it is pretty much connected to travel. It is pretty much connected to Europe's experiences at other places around the world. Of course, it connects back to history once again. What are those major historical events in Europe that we like to think about as being the basis of European values? Of course, we would consider the Renaissance as one of the major historical periods when the love of arts started to become a well-established value within the European identity. Also, we would probably mention religion, Catholicism or the Protestant religion, and how it connects back to the development of capitalism, if we think about the work ethic, especially the Protestant work ethic. And also we would probably mention the Enlightenment period, which was the age of reason, the age of science, and also the age of liberty, freedom, and equality. These are all European values that are historically at the very core of European identity. For me, being in Asia, it was really important to recognize that it is not exactly the same way how people outside of Europe see European history.
I want you to get back on that issue, the last thing that you mentioned, but what is interesting to me and what I want to learn a little bit more about is that you mentioned those really huge, big, kind of iconic, events in European history and how they shaped the way we are today, our identities and the values that we say we share. I mean, that's another question if it's true or not any longer. But what is really exciting for me to hear more about is how these things have been changing as we speak, because I think we have entered an era in global history in which globalization is no longer just an empty slogan, but it really is the everyday lived experience of all 7 billion of us living on this planet. So I want to know how do you see these values being changed by these transformations? So how do you, as a young man in your early 40s, see these issues, for example, big global issues seen from Europe as compared to seen from other places of the world, like climate change, like sustainable development, global security? Today is late January 2020, and the whole world is talking about this new virus. So everything becomes a global issue. How do younger generations respond to these challenges on this continent, Europe?
I think younger generations are absolutely aware of these happenings all around the world. So Europeans are very much well informed. Although I would say they are pretty much, they tend to be sometimes obsessed by their own problems. So, for example, if we think about the major discourses, the major issues that are preoccupying European public opinion, not necessarily climate change at this point, but we talk a lot about immigration, for example. We talk about the state of democracy in different countries all around Europe. However, I see that as young people travel from Europe to other places all around the world, and as other places from all around the world start to appear in Europe itself, then this kind of interaction is very intense. And here I think about places like Amsterdam or Berlin, where you actually don't have to leave Europe to meet the world right there. I mean, we are talking about decades of immigration experiences when the face, the culture of Europe have been changed, and probably these experiences had a great influence on European identity itself. So when we talk about young people and what Europe means to young people, I would definitely think that globalization is there at the very core of European identity. Multiculturalism, the respect for other cultures, the problem for the respect for the problem of others, the different ways of life are very much there in the younger generations' Europe ideas or how they imagine Europe.
We also read about those kind of sometimes stereotypical images that we have of each other. Europeans are like this, Asians are like that, Africans are like that, North Americans are like this and that. How do you see that? Does the European mind or mindset or psyche, does it really differ? And if it does, in what ways from Asian mindset, Asian way of thinking? So, because you really are one of the very few people who actually lived and experienced both worlds. So how do they compare with each other? These, how do those identities come into being, and what are the results of those processes?
So, if I want to answer this question, I can't avoid going back to history, talking about history again a little bit. because when we try to identify certain cultural psyches or cultural identities, then talking about Europe and its relationship to the rest of the world, we cannot avoid talking about Orientalism. Orientalism is a very much established way of seeing and representing, especially the East, coming from Europe. One of the latest arguments that came out of Orientalist thinking, I think, is the Asian values argument.
Okay.
And according to the Asian values argumentation, which have been actually accepted by many of the Southeast Asian leaders throughout last decades, Asians are considered to be more family-oriented, more community-oriented, much more disciplined, maybe less eager in terms of freedom, liberty, or issues of democracy. And Europeans like to think about themselves and their way of thinking that these values, especially freedom, especially equality, liberty, are at the very core of the European identity.
Are they?
So, when you travel to Europe, when you travel out of Europe, I think, and this connects back to the very first question, these major points of European history are actually seen in a completely different way. When we talk about Enlightenment, we also have to mention colonialism. And from other parts of the world, you cannot talk about Europe without talking about the colonial experience. So, I think that...
are we more individualistic? Because it's one of those stereotypes that, individual liberty, competition among individuals in Europe or Western civilization is, they are said to be kind of core values, either positive or negative, but really very much embedded in this kind of culture. First of all, do you think it still holds true? That's my first question. The second one is, how does it compare with the Asian scenario? Are they less individual? Are they, less keen on those values that we connect with Enlightenment and the European traditions like democracy, individual freedom, competition? How about, religious thought, for example? How about family values? How do you compare these two societies, Western societies, to speak generally, and Asian societies?
I think here I have to mention some of my personal experiences. Okay. I studied in Asia. Later I taught in Asia.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that's super important. How would you compare the education systems, for example? You've been part of the European in many countries in Europe, and you've been part of that in Asia. So you are, one of the very few people who have hands-on experience on both systems. Is it more kind of challenging and more... what's the word I'm looking for? Are there more pressure on Asian students, for example?
I think, as of my personal experiences, education systems in Southeast Asia especially are very competitive.
Okay.
Which also means that there is a great emphasis on knowledge. I think knowledge and education has really great value for individual development and also for societal development as a community issue. I'm not completely sure that in Europe, where universities have been established for hundreds of years, we still consider those institutions that central to development of a community. But as of my experience in Asia, I can tell that knowledge and education is pretty much at the very core of how Asians today imagine their future. And if you look around in any big Asian city, from Bangkok to Kuala Lumpur or to Singapore, or even if you just go to Phnom Penh and see how it changed in the last 10 years, for example, then you will see that we are probably living in an Asian century. I'm brave to say that probably in Bangkok there are more skyscrapers than in Berlin, London, and Frankfurt altogether. Sure, yeah. The architecture is modernizing in incredible speed. The demographics are very promising. There are many young people there, and development, community development, innovation, education are very much there, and there seems to be a consensus within these Asian societies, that these things will define their own future.
Mm-hmm. Do you see, I mean, you've mentioned so many very important issues. Do you see some of them as contributing to a new emerging European identity? So are there issues, topics, feelings, attitudes, orientations that Europeans actually should take over from our Asian friends, like, for example, hard work, for example, or even harder competition or being on top of things? So you see the question. I mean, there's a new European identity emerging as we speak because of the global issues. How do Asian values contribute to that new European identity?
This is a very, very good question. Now, I again have to start with a personal impression, which is that wherever I traveled and lived in Asia, people were just extremely friendly to me. So wherever I traveled, I always felt at home.
Okay.
It was like really arriving at home. I mean, being in a family. So if there is something we can learn here in Europe about Asia, is that just because you are coming from different place, you can be welcomed. Okay. I think it is there in Asia wherever you go. And then another thing is that when you travel in Asia and when you live there for extended periods, actually you start to admit that probably the place and significance of Europe is completely different looking from other parts of the world than it seems to be from the core of Europe. So I think if there is something we can learn from Asia, or from the New World Order, let's put it this way, is that Europe has to find its new voice, its new position, and its new role in the world. And if you ask me, probably it will be closer to learning about tolerance and to learning about cooperation than to show any kind of leadership anymore.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a good closing point, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you.